Hello and welcome to episode 53 of Question and Answer. I am your host, as usual, Panyo Basa. And it's only been a week since the last Q&A, but I've gotten a lot of questions, probably more than I got in the previous 3 weeks. So I figure I shouldn't just procrastinate and start answering questions. Make hay while the sun shines and all that. And first, I have to sit here and chill out a little bit, sit here in silence for 5 minutes, and then I just sit here and give some kind of random monologue before I start answering questions. It's like a tradition now. So I'm just kind of decompressing or chilling out, getting into the groove, so to speak. And I guess I should start answering questions now, huh? And the first question is from Cherzowix's. And this was supposed to be answered like 2 episodes ago. He asked the question late after I'd already recorded episode 51 or whatever it was. And then I neglected to add it to the next list. So this is like a month ago he asked this question. And I should say that Trzowicz, or however you pronounce it, he very generously sent me the means to get a new video camera, which is very nice of him. And I haven't got it yet, but in the last episode, the previous episode, I went blurry for like the last 15-20 minutes of the video. The camera was supposed to have autofocus, but what it was focusing on, I have no idea, because my face was not the object of the focus. So I'll probably get that. We'll see if there's any improvement. But anyways, I should answer this question. So Cherzowix says, a while ago you said that in your tradition monks do not lie down. Is it hard? Is it easy? What I mean is, if I was not to lie down for a few days, I would surely fall asleep without any problem in any possible position. So after initial struggle, is it hard to sleep not in the horizontal position? So what he's referring to is the sitter's practice. It's one of the 13 Dhutanga practices of a Theravada Buddhist monk. They're like optional, additional ascetic practices. And one of those is never lying down. You sleep in a sitting position. And the tradition in which I was ordained, the Tampulu tradition, it was traditional for monks not to lie down in that tradition. So for my first, let's say, my first maybe almost 2 years as a monk, I did the sitter's practice. But when I got to Burma, like central Burma, the blazing furnace of central Burma, I quickly realized that the coolest position is to be flat on your back, spread eagle on a concrete floor. So that's pretty much how I started sleeping, which is kind of ascetic in and of itself, sleeping on a concrete floor with a piece of wood for a pillow. But it sounds ascetic, but really, seriously, it was the most comfortable way of sleeping at the time, because the concrete is cool, you're close to the floor where it's coolish, and the piece of wood doesn't absorb sweat like a cloth pillow does. A cloth pillow starts smelling like an old gym sock or something, an old work glove, pretty quickly. So anyway, he's asking, is it hard to do the sitter's practice? And for me, it was. It was not easy to get into the habit of sitting. As I've explained before, each of the 13 Dhutangas has 3 levels, according to the Visuddhimagga: easy, medium, and hard. And most of the Tampulu monks would do the easy way, which is they'd sit in a chair, which was kind of almost a reclining chair. They were made out of like bamboo, and they're tilted back at about a 45-degree angle so that you're kind of reclining when you're sleeping. And they're fairly comfortable, although they're all way too small for me. My head would just be hanging off the back of the thing. So I couldn't really use those. And anyway, I wanted to be a little more rigorous than that. So I went for the medium level. And the medium level of the sitter's practice is you're allowed to lean back against something, like lean back against a wall or against a board. Or another option is you take a like a cord or a belt or something, and you can like you sit with your knees up, and then you put it around your knees and your back, and that kind of holds you up. But I lean back against a board, and it was it was surprisingly difficult because at first, for a few weeks at least, I'd fall asleep in the sitting position, and then I'd wake up like 2 in the morning, lying on my side, like flopped over in the middle of the night, and I didn't notice. There were a few times I'd be sitting cross-legged, and I'd flop over, and I'd still be cross-legged. My legs would still be like this, sort of like a Buddha statue tilted on its side. But yeah, it was difficult for me. Um, let's see. Let's see, what I mean is this is Chirzaux is saying, what I mean is if I was not to lie down for a few days, I would surely fall asleep without any problem, any possible position. Still, it's difficult to stay in the sitting position. I mean, it's easy just to like flop over and be horizontal after you fall asleep. So I guess I answered that question. So I'll just move on to Chirzaux' next question here. Are monastic rules only for unenlightened men or women? If, for example, an Arahant has accepted money and bought himself or herself a sweatsuit and a razor and shaved his beard himself or herself, yeah, she's not going to be shaving her beard, I hope. Looking directly into the mirror, it would be breaking of many rules, but nothing morally wrong with it for the Arahant, surely. Well, it's kind of an interesting question. And it is there, if you read the origin stories of the rules of monastic discipline, a few times an Arahant has been the first person to break a rule. I can't think of which one it was. I think one was like saving food overnight and eating it the next day. I think there was an Arahant who was the first one recorded to break that rule. At least tradition says so, because he just wanted to be less of a burden on his supporters. He'd go for alms round once, and his bowl full of food would last him for days. So he'd just eat a little bit each day. But he was told not to do that anymore. And the thing is, even Arahants are supposed to follow the rules of monastic discipline. I mean, for a monk, one of the kinds of morality is patimokkha samarasila, or the morality of restraint in accordance with the patimokkha rules, or the rules of monastic discipline. So even though he's fully enlightened, he's still obligated to follow the rules, even though it's really not necessary anymore. I mean, he's crossed to the other shore. He's laid down the burden and is freed, and so I mean, he doesn't need the raft anymore, so he can kind of dismiss that. But still, because he's a member of the Sangha has rules, and to just start breaking those rules, in a sense, would sort of like be flirting with dishonesty or a dishonest life. So even Arahants that don't really need to practice for enlightenment anymore, still, because they're still monks, they still follow the rules. So, I mean, there are a lot of rules that really don't have anything to do with morality, whether you're a monk or whether you're enlightened or not. Like eating in the afternoon. There's nothing more moral about eating in the morning than eating in the afternoon. Or shaving your head. I mean, it's not immoral to have head hair. There's what color of robes are allowable, what materials, the way you sew it. There's so much of the Vinaya rules that really have nothing to do with basic morality. It's just like etiquette, or just like ancient Indian tradition, stuff like that. So let's see. So the monastic rules are not only for unenlightened men or women. They're for anyone who's joined the order voluntarily and has taken upon themselves these precepts. And if you don't want to follow the precepts anymore, then the honest thing to do is to drop out, which is what I eventually did. So I think I'll just move on to the next question, also from Truzawick. And he says, how exactly did you move all those books walking on foot from one place to another in Louisiana? Or did you have like half of those books behind your back then? And at first I didn't understand this question. At first I thought he was talking about Burma. Like, how did I travel around in Burma with so many books? Because as you can see, I do have a bookcase that's more than half full of books. And then the Louisiana part, it took me a while. And then finally I realized he's talking about the one night or 2 nights I spent, especially the first night I spent in New Orleans. It's not pronounced New Orleans, mind you. Everyone there calls it New Orleans. So if you go there and call it New Orleans, people know you're from out of town, and I don't know, maybe they won't trust you or something. Xenophobia. So let's see. How did I move all the books walking from one place to another in Louisiana? Well, first of all, I sent a few boxes of books by mail to South Carolina before I got on the train to come to South Carolina. But I did have, most of my possessions were books as a monk. And so I did have like this big clunky footlocker. It was like a Burmese military footlocker made out of steel. Had no wheels or anything, no hand, even the handle eventually broke off of it. So it was really a bastard to get around. And I had a suitcase, and I also had like this little backpack thing, like a knapsack that I had stuff stuffed into. And yeah, my first night in New Orleans, that was an ordeal. I was really thinking that I was going to have to sleep on the street that night. I go to this hotel, relatively nice hotel. I go to the desk. I just lugged all my stuff. Or wait, I got off the train and took a cab, and then the cabbie just left me there. So it's hard enough just lugging all of my luggage into the lobby of this hotel. And I had cash. And I was willing to pay with cash, and he said, I'm sorry, we don't accept cash. You have to use credit cards. I didn't have a credit card. I didn't have credit. I didn't have any kind of credit rating at all. My credit rating was the empty set. It was just non-existent. And so he said, well, the Holiday Inn a couple blocks down the road will almost certainly take cash. So then I'm like trying to carry and drag all of this stuff 2 blocks, and I was exhausted just going 2 blocks in like the sweltering heat. And I get there, and they didn't take cash either. It's all credit cards. If you don't have a credit card, you cannot stay there. You can be overflowing with money, thousands of dollars. They won't take the money, which was it's just strange to me. That's what money is for. It says right on the back, for all debts, legal, or I don't remember what it says. But it just seems strange that they would reject cash when that's what cash is for, is to pay for stuff. So anyway, I had to make it all the way back. I called my sweetheart in desperation in the middle of the night, and she was able to somehow get her credit card to pay for my room. And then, they wouldn't let me check in. I'm like standing there at the desk wanting to check in. The money part was taken care of, and they say, no, you can't check in here. It's like, well, do you have any vacancies? And they say, yeah, we have vacancies, but still, you can't check in here. You have to make a reservation. So what I had to do, I had to go to sit on a couch 30 feet away, and on my computer, using Wi-Fi, I make a reservation, then I get up and go back. It was just really weird. But I'm completely digressing here. So how did I move all those books? Yeah, it was very difficult, and eventually the handle in the footlocker broke, and it was just, it was like a Herculean labor just getting all my luggage around, because there was still a lot of books in my luggage, but I didn't have this many. But at first I thought Truzawick was asking about how I did it as a monk in Burma. And my first several years as a monk, I had maybe 20 pounds of books. And then somebody donated to me an entire Pali Tipitaka, like 40 volumes, So, I mean, there's no way I could carry that around. I mean, 20 pounds of books, that's still manageable. You can still carry it, technically. I didn't have, as I say, I really didn't have many other possessions besides just bowls. My bowl, which I still have, and robes and so forth. Um, but then eventually I just kind of gave up on the struggle to keep my books down to a manageable amount, that I could just carry everything that I own, and just take off walking with it. That was the ideal. That is the ideal for a monk. But I eventually just gave up. In fact, I used to keep my books at this place in the town of Wonduin. I had a supporter there. They had like this extra building, like an outbuilding, where I would stay there when I would visit. My stuff would be stored there. And I think it was around June of 1999, there was a flash flood. The dam broke, and I mean, the place where I kept everything was like 6 feet underwater. It was soaking. Some of these books on the bookshelf right back there, soaked in muddy water for like 48 hours. They were just completely submerged, and I had to come back. I mean, it was just mud everywhere. There's human corpses everywhere before I got there. Those got cleaned up, but there were still like dead cows and dead dogs and stuff lying around. It was like 700 people died in that flood, and I mean, it's like the American media is like this now, but the Burmese media, which was, controlled by the military government, you didn't hear a word about it. It was all word of mouth. People would just hear about it from somebody else who heard about it from somebody else maybe. And that's kind of how you hear the important stuff nowadays. I mean, you don't hear about it on CNN unless it's, something that's good for the Democrats, then you'll hear about, or good for globalists in general. But anything that's bad for Democrats, like corruption in the Democratic Party or in the White House or whatever, nothing. You don't hear about that. You just hear, 51 authorities declaring that it's all just Russian disinformation or whatever. But again, I'm just digressing all over the place. Have a drink. Sweet tea. So in other words, what happened was the gods are warning me I'm keeping too many books by sending this flash flood that kills 700 people, and I just kept collecting books. So I was just a lost cause at that point. So I think I'll just move on to the next question here, and this is from Achala, and this may be some dishonesty on my part, because I told Achala that he would be first, because he asked the question before I uploaded the last Q&A, but it was after I'd already recorded it. So I said, well, you'll be at the top of the list next time. And then Trezalix's comes out and tells me that there was one from like 2 Q&As in the past that I hadn't answered, so I had to put him at the top. And I hope Achala will forgive me for breaking my promise. I told him he would be at the top of the list. He'd be the first question, and it didn't happen. So I make public confession, and I'll try to do better in future. And breaking promises, I mean, it's a mild kind of dishonesty. For a monk, I believe the commentaries say it is a dukkha offense, or a minor offense for a monk to break a promise. Even though, I mean, there's no deliberate attempt to deceive. It's just that you say you're going to do something and then you don't do it. So it's good to always be careful. God willing, I'll do it. If nothing stops me from doing it, I'll do it. Put in some qualifiers so that if some act of God prevents you from keeping your promise, then you're sort of flirting with dishonesty. So Achala says, I see some Buddhist monks, especially from Mahayana, trying to speak up for climate change, seeing it as a threat. I am personally least worried about it. Trying to fix samsara or find a perfect happy place in samsara is just not realistic and not Dhamma. It's natural for the climate to change. it would go against the nature of impermanence if the climate doesn't change. The problem is rooted in our ignorance and not being able to see the reality as it is. I also believe Buddhist monks should refrain from engaging in such worldly matters, as usually such things are politically motivated. What's your take on the matter from a Buddhist perspective? Well, I don't think it's necessarily immoral for a monk to be concerned about climate change and to share his concerns with people that he talks to, because, I mean, if he's motivated by compassion, let's say, he believes all the, the alarmism, and he thinks, if we don't get down to carbon neutral within the next, however many years, we're doomed. And that's, I mean, it's not really true. I mean, the climate is warming to some degree. The climate is changing. As Achala here points out, the climate's always changing. In fact, for most of the history of this planet, things have been warmer than now. Literally, we are still in an ice age. So long as you've got glaciation, you've got glaciers on the surface, you've got ice caps at all, then you're still in a time that could be called an ice age. We're just sort of in between the big glaciations, but still the Earth is cooler now than usual. But I watch a lot of like evolution videos about, the evolution of the jaw. Moth Light Media is a really good channel for that sort of thing. And there have been mass die-offs over and over again. And some of these mass die-offs have been caused by climate change. In fact, most of them have been, if you include volcanoes and comet impacts and so forth, that are causing just immediate radical climate change. But sometimes it's just natural changes that are causing the climate to change, so that the established species that are like living in various environments, they just can't adapt fast enough and they die out. So, but I mean, if you've got a monk or a Buddhist teacher, a Buddhist anybody who really is concerned for the welfare of all beings on this planet and takes it seriously, he doesn't think that maybe, the globalist powers that be are just wanting us to be afraid of this because it suits their purposes. I mean, there are things more dangerous than climate change, I guarantee it. I mean, nukes still exist. In fact, there's more countries now that have nukes than back in the 80s, when everyone was saying, nuclear winter, we're all fucked. If we don't get rid of nukes, we're all done for. AI, the technological singularity, that potentially is more dangerous, and there's less we can do about it. It's going to be instantaneous when it happens, or within a very short time. Unlike climate change, people are very adaptable. So, yeah, if it's politically motivated, I mean, if the person who's talking about it is himself politically motivated, then maybe, I mean, you're getting into, borderline inappropriate speech. But if he's just sincerely, to the best of his understanding, trying to, prevent dukkha on a huge scale on this planet, then yeah, I think he'd still be doing okay with regard to Dhamma, even if he's misguided or just naive and believing the official narrative, which is pretty much manipulated by the globalist powers that be. I mean, a scientist can be bought as easily as a judge or a politician. And even without buying scientists, it's the scientists who agree with the narrative that are getting the funding. Anyone who goes against the narrative, he can lose his job. So we don't need to get into that. Maybe I should apologize. Maybe I should apologize, because I'm answering these questions. About 10% of the actual words that are coming out of my mouth are directly answering the questions, and I'm just digressing all over the place. So I'll just move on to the next question. And this is from Fred. And Fred says, did you shave your eyebrows in Myanmar like Thai monks? And no, I did not. It's shaving the eyebrows is predominantly a Thai thing. It's a Thai cultural thing. The Vinaya says a monk has to shave his his head hair and his facial hair. Um, doesn't mention anything about eyebrows specifically, but the Thais shave their eyebrows. They don't clip off their eyelashes though, so they're still not 100%. But I think I answered this a question along these lines not long ago. That it was started off. I heard this story. It's like a legend, like an origin myth or something of why Thai monks shave their eyebrows. And it was Burma or Myanmar and Thailand were traditional arch enemies. You know, they were like Sparta and Athens or England and France. You know, they were just like the traditional favorite enemies of each other. And so they would send spies across the border disguised as monks to, you know, spy out the land and find out what's going on and all that. And so the Thais started shaving their eyebrows so they would be able to tell the difference between their real monks and the fake Burmese spy monks. So then, of course, the Burmese spies would start shaving their eyebrows too, so they'd blend in. But then the spies on the other side of the border in Burma would see the spy monks when they would come back. You know, they'd see a shaven-headed guy with no eyebrows. They'd know he was a spy, unless maybe he was just a renegade Thai just who decided to defect to Burma or something. So, yeah, only Thai monks shave their eyebrows. Even a few of those are getting to the point where they don't do it, especially like the Western monks. Some of the Ajahn Chah monks who live in the West, they don't bother shaving their eyebrows. It's really unnecessary. So I'll just move on to the next question. This is from Francois, alias Francois. And Francois says, long time ago, I had a graduate course on Indian Buddhism with one of the main translator of the Dalai Lama. While studying early Mahayana Buddhist texts, not Nagarjuna, more like Vasubandhu, if I recall correctly, we found out that in some texts, the notion of Anatman had actually almost the same meaning as Atman, ultimate nature of reality, universal panacea, etc., which was quite funny. Anatta is so counterintuitive, so reification is always very tempting. Aha. Do you think Nagarjuna's interpretation of anatta or emptiness fits with what is found in the Pali Canon? My knowledge of Nagarjuna is quite limited, but it seems to me an acceptable stretch. Thoughts? So I've decided that if I discuss Majjhimaka, because it is so profound, that it would aid my ability to answer if I wear the fez. So let's see here. Okay. So there's actually two kinds of questions in here that I'd like to address here. One is we found out that in some texts the notion anatman had actually almost the same meaning as atman. And yeah, I mean, I've discussed this a lot. This is like one of the recurring themes of my Q&As and of some of my writing is that everything and nothing, you know, it's like the beginning of Hegel's dialectic in his logic. He starts off with pure being, and then he points out that pure being and its antithesis, pure non-being, are just interchangeable. They're indistinguishable. Neither one of them has any discernible content because both are just absolute without any boundaries, without any differences. And so if you take that to Atman as absolute, you know, like the Upanishadic idea of, you know, Atman is God, you know, it's Brahman, it's ultimate reality, then again, you know, the everything and the nothing, they just merge into one. So, yeah, I mean, a kind of universalist Atman would be very similar. I mean, to the extent that you're not reifying it as a this, you know, as a thing, then to the extent that you're not reifying it, then it just blends in with, you know, like the absolute and nothing just they become indistinguishable. So it is counterintuitive. It's paradoxical, and I've tried to explain it many times, but it's some things you just can't explain in a reasonable way. And I do hope that the top of my fez isn't being completely cut off here. Here, I've got to do this. So, just a tassel a little bit. So there is that when you're dealing with the absolute, that's anything that's infinite and formless, it's going to be paradoxical, and it's going to transcend the duality of is and isn't, and to some degree even the duality of Atman and Anatman, which, I mean, you just can't wrap your head around it. You cannot understand reality intellectually. The intellect cannot deal with infinity, for example. Formless infinity, the intellect cannot deal with it. It can't grasp it. So that would be my answer to that. But then the main question here is, do you think Nagarjuna's interpretation of anatta, or emptiness, fits with what is found in the Pali Canon? Okay, so, and I might as well add here, he says, my knowledge of Nagarjuna is quite limited, but it seems to me an acceptable stretch. He has that quotes there. And then he asked for my thoughts. And I think Nagarjuna did succeed in giving a kind of philosophical, like, framework, not even a framework, like a philosophical explanation of the teachings of the Atthakavagga, of the Sutta Nipata, where they're saying, don't believe anything, have no views, you know, it's not really skepticism. It's like radical mysticism where, I mean, you can know the truth. Unlike the skeptics who say you can't know the truth, a mystic says you can know the truth, but you can't know the truth intellectually. So you've got to dismiss the intellect, you've got to dismiss perception. And then the truth is there. The truth is always there. Reality is always right here. We're soaking in it. And Nagarjuna is the one who was able to come up with, maybe by that time, by the time of Nagarjuna, there was enough sophistication in philosophy and logic that you could actually build up a philosophy that could account for these very cryptic, sometimes paradoxical statements in the Atthakavagga. It's sort of Zen-like. Some scholars have called the Atthakavagga proto-Madhyamaka. So I think Nagarjuna was able, I mean, he was one of the most successful thinkers or mystics who was able to explain why the Atthakavagga says what it says about how a monk should have no view, no perception, no belief. So I do think that Nagarjuna in his Mula Madhyamaka Karika, for example, did a very good job of like explaining that and justifying that philosophically. And it wasn't skepticism like, what was his name? Sextus Empiricus? Yeah, if you're not familiar with Western philosophy, you might not know who I'm talking about. But he was like a classical skeptic that lived in ancient Rome, or the ancient Roman state. So, yeah, I think I answered that question. I can take the fez off now. It is a nice fez, though. I mean, anyone who's considering getting a fez, Fezorama makes really good fezes. I'm really happy with this fez. And there's a wide variety of different kinds of tassels, too. High quality stuff. So I'll just move on to the next question here. And this is from Kazen, I think. K-Z-E-N. Maybe it's K-Zen, but it looks like Kazen. So some sort of space alien name. And Kazen says, curious if there were lots of Burmese lay people with high attainments. Well, I mean, there's really not lots of even monks with high attainments, it seems to me. I mean, they're always going to be relatively rare. They're always going to form a tiny minority, it seems to me. I mean, you can read in the past of how there were lots and lots of people with high attainments, but it's kind of questionable. Like, I read the poems of Han Shan, and Han Shan was like this Zen figure in Chinese Buddhism who was supposed to be really advanced. I mean, he was supposed to be like this enlightened, Zen master or something. But you read his poems, and there's a lot of like complaining, and I mean, he doesn't really. I mean, he praises the holy life, and he has wise poems. But some of the poems, you see that he was sort of on the wrong side of a civil war. He was, he had to just flee and hide out in the woods, and he adopted that life largely of necessity. He would have preferred to be some aristocrat, that was in power with lots of money and so forth. And so, I mean, it helps you to understand how you get all these legends of all these super wise, advanced beings in the past, where it's no longer verifiable. I assume that the Buddha himself had quite a few like really advanced disciples, and there have been certain like resurgences of Dhamma, like including like medieval Chinese Zen, where I mean I wouldn't be at all surprised if there really were lots of monks with high attainments and also lots of lay people too. Um, but I mean it's always going to be a minority even then. Like all of the Buddha's disciples were not enlightened. So, I mean, there's one really famous Burmese layperson with high attainments, and that's Uba Khin, who was Goenka's teacher. S.N. Goenka, he was a layperson. I don't know how high his attainments were, but his own teacher was a kind of bureaucrat in the Burmese government, back before it was a military dictatorship. And, he was like a meditation master, and he was a layperson. A lot of Burmese lay people, they're good at meditating just because they're not compulsive thinkers like us. But it's like their approach to Buddhism is very faith oriented. And if you're familiar with Theravada Buddhist philosophy, there are like the five faculties, the five indriyas. And one of them is panya, which in this case doesn't so much mean wisdom, it just means like cleverness or like quickness of mind, readiness of wit. And then that is supposed to be balanced out with another one, saddha or faith. And if you have too much panya and not enough saddha, you're not going to believe anything. The Visuddhimagga says you're going to be like a person whose sickness is caused by the medicine he takes. But if you have too much saddha and not enough panya, then you can believe anything. If you've got too much faith and not enough critical thinking, then you can believe anything, no matter how ridiculous it is. And there's a lot of that going on nowadays. I mean, it's always gone on. It's because we're just human, all too human. But if you have too much of this cleverness, then you're just going to be like a skeptic. You're going to demand more data or whatever before you make your decision or whatever, and you're going to wind up not believing anything. You just get overanalysis paralysis or whatever. So, there are probably more Burmese lay people with high attainments than American lay people with high attainments, just because they live a simple life. They believe Dhamma without question. It's largely faith, but still it strengthens them in their practice, in their motivation to practice. And I mean, some of the most virtuous, good people I've ever known lived in Burmese villages. So they were good people. They weren't necessarily enlightened sages, but they were definitely, might be what's called like a chula sotapanna, where they're not technically a sotapanna, but they're so rooted in living a virtuous life that they're pretty much guaranteed of moving upwards, or they're moving in the right direction. So I guess I'll just move on to the next question here. This is from Hurdy Gurdy Man. And Hurdy Gurdy Man says, if non-existence is an aspect of samsara, simply the opposite of existence, does not existence create karma? Or does non-existence create karma? Okay, so that's the question. Does non-existence create karma? And there are suttas like the Kalahawiwada Sutta of the Atthakavagga of the Sutta Nipata, which says that existence and non-existence are derived from ultimately from perception. So that, it's like a duality, existence and non-existence. They're both perceptions and they rely upon each other. They kind of dependently co-arise. So that's the kind of thing that is really an aspect of samsara. If something really doesn't exist in like an objective or beyond objective, just in reality, then that wouldn't create karma. But still, trying to reify all that, you're turning it into a something, and that creates karma. So the idea of non-existence creates karma. I guess that would be the simplest way of explaining it. And there's a similar question to this a little farther down that I may enlarge upon. But yeah, non-existence creates karma to the extent that in order for this non-existence to exist, you have to have a concept or an idea or a perception of non-existence. And that is volitional, and it's creating karma. So let's move on to the next question. This is from Sharp Rock. And Sharp Rock says, if one is having trouble with sensual desire while meditating in a beautiful setting, would you recommend creating a duller environment, more like a sensory deprivation chamber, to eliminate stimuli? Or should I keep meditating on that beautiful setting and work on cultivating mindfulness of the sensual desire? Well, I mean, if you read the Pali texts, it says none of the above. I mean, some of the Pali texts say that you should seek out like what is repulsive. You should go and contemplate rotting corpses, for example. I mean, that was relatively common practice in the Buddhist time. It's hard to find rotting corpses nowadays, unless you might live near a battlefield or something. But so I mean, that would be like ideal from the ancient Indian hardcore ascetic point of view. Is if you're having trouble with sensual desire while meditating in a beautiful setting, find a non-beautiful setting, like something ugly. Like in the Rahula Sutta, which is in the Sutta Nipata. There's two Rahula Suttas. I'm referring to the one in the Sutta Nipata. The Buddha advises, presumably his own son, who had ordained by that time, avoid anything beautiful and associated with passion, and seek out what is revolting. So I mean, that's one thing, but then you might have to like gear your meditation towards contemplation of repulsiveness or so forth. But if you just want to meditate on your breath, then yeah, I mean, if you're having trouble with sensual desire while meditating in a beautiful setting, then yeah, just go the Zen route or keep your eyes closed. Just sit in a blank room, just stare at a blank wall, keep your eyes closed where it's just black, and that should help. So, yeah, I mean, it's becoming sort of tantric. You're playing with fire when you keep meditating in the beautiful setting that is distracting you and work on cultivating mindfulness of the sensual desire. I mean, it's possible. It's sort of like the tantric path, the left-handed path, because most people fail at that. It's more dangerous. It's maybe more suited to the Kali Yuga, to the spiritual dark age that allegedly we are in right now. But you'd have to have a good teacher, I think, to help guide you through that sort of thing. So I'll just move on to the next question. This is from Ketchup. And Ketchup says, what if someone was being harmed into breaking a precept? What should they do? And I asked Ketchup, what does he mean by that? I don't really understand what it means by if someone is harmed into breaking a precept. Then this was in a YouTube comment, and then below that there was a reply by Terzaux's, and Terzaux's added that maybe it is about a monk being raped by a male prostitute. So it's hard for me to answer this question, mainly because I don't really understand what it means to be harmed into breaking a precept. If you're being forced into something, let's say somebody's being raped, then, I mean, so long as you're not volitionally doing it, so long as you're not consenting, then you're not doing anything wrong. Like with regard to um, a monk who gets raped. Let's say he's raped by a woman, because this used to actually happen, like in Burma under the military dictatorship. Some monks would be troublemakers. They'd be protesting against the government and so forth. And so you can't just defrock a monk. Nobody has the authority to defrock a monk except for that monk himself. Now, he can be like admonished and even sort of put on a kind of probation. He can be given the silent treatment. Other monks can avoid him and all that, but nobody has the authority to just make him not be a monk anymore other than himself, unless he commits a parajika offense. So what the military government would do is, you got this monk in this prison cell, and they would just hire a prostitute to like entice him, lure him, get him excited or whatever. And so long as his penis, enters into any of her three orifices, the three main ones, I should say, to the extent of the width of a sesame seed, he's not a monk anymore if he consents to it. And that's pretty much what it is. It's like in the text, like in the Winnia rules, it says, if you consent while inserting it, that's it, you're excommunicated. If you don't consent while inserting it, but you consent, while it's in there, then also you're excommunicated. And if you don't consent while inserting it, and you don't consent while it's in there, but you do consent while you're pulling it out, then you're excommunicated. So, I mean, if it's not volitional on your part, then you're not really doing anything wrong. I mean, what should the person do if they're being forced into doing bad things? I mean, if they have no choice, they're just being forced, like being raped, for example. Um, I mean, really, they're not doing anything wrong other than just their mental states that are going on. And so they should really try to be as mindful, try not to be wallowing in fear or terror or rage or anything like that, because then you're making karma, bad karma. Being harmed into breaking a precept, if it's just like peer group pressure, you're just being pressured into breaking a rule. It's like your parents are insisting that you do something that you think is, like join the army or something that you consider to be morally indefensible. Then, I mean, you just have to like stand by your morals. You have to stand by your conscience and defy even your own parents if necessary. So again, I'm really not sure what Ketchup had in mind by this question of what if someone was being harmed into breaking a precept. But I mean, if it's not volitional at all, then I mean, you're not really doing anything, because the doing is the volition. It's the mental state accompanying the action. But if someone is just pressuring you, I mean, even if it's at gunpoint, they're saying, kill this other person or I kill you, you still have the choice to just refuse and take the bullet, which would be the dharmically correct thing to do. So I guess I'll just move on to the next question. This is from Ludovic Balam. And Ludovic Balam says, in the Prakrit language, and I think he mainly means the Pali language, is there a separate concept for ghost, or would ghosts be considered devas? Second part, is devas the word they use in Pali, or is there another term? Well, in Pali, the word for a god, a small g god, below the level of a Brahma, yeah, that would be a deva, dewa. But there definitely is a different word for ghosts than for devas. The word for ghosts in Pali, the usual word is peta. And I think I've explained before that peta is derived from the same word as father. In Pali, it's pita, or pitar is father, which goes back into Proto-Indo-European, and the English word father is derived from the same root as the Pali word pitar. But the Germanic languages, which includes English, P turns to the F sound. So, and the reason why ghosts have a name that's derived from the word father is because they were the original concept of the petas were ancestors. It was ancestor worship, and there's still some of that going on in India today, where you have to make offerings to your ancestors, and if you don't make offerings to them, they become miserable and hungry and so forth. And that's where the idea of hungry ghosts comes from. That's why ghosts are called hungry ghosts in Buddhism, because those are the ancestors, or originally the meaning was those are the ancestors that didn't get offerings from their descendants. And so they're in a state of, distress, hunger or whatever. But then later on, in Buddhist cosmology, the petas were considered to be hungry just because they would have like a pinhole-sized mouth and a huge stomach, or a huge mouth and like a pinhead-sized stomach, and it was just a kind of punishment, because the petas live in one of the lower realms. You got 4 lower realms. You got hell, you got ghosts, you got animals, and you got the asuras, which are kind of awkward. They're not mentioned a lot, or at least they're not mentioned as many times as the other 3 in the Pali texts. So ghosts are considered to be a subhuman level on the 31 planes of existence, whereas devas are superhuman level. But if you read the texts, it's a spectrum. Like the highest ghost is right up against the same level as the lowest deva. And if you read a strange text called the Peta Watu, or the Ghost Stories, it's actually canonical, or at least, yeah, the book itself is canonical, although most of the stories are in the commentary. And you see that these ghost stories are mainly about a ghost that's almost a god. It's essentially lives the life of a god, but it has something wrong. It's got like stinking bad breath, or it has to be naked all the time. Or one story that I told, it's one of my favorite ghost stories in the Pali texts, is there was this woman, a female goddess essentially, who every night she'd go into this trance and descend from her mansion, and a black dog would devour her, just eat all the meat off of her bones. The bones would fall into this lotus pool, and then the flesh would grow back. She'd climb out of the pool and go back up into her bedroom and go back to sleep, and then that would recur every night. But aside from being eaten by a dog every night, I mean, she lived in this beautiful palace. She had this lifespan of thousands of years. She had these celestial attendants, celestial servants and so forth, surrounded by these beautiful parks of celestial trees and all this. So yeah, so it's a continuum. It's like a spectrum, and the devas are like the subhuman part, and the petas, or ghosts, are the subhuman part, and the devas are the superhuman. It's just, so yeah. And again, I'm being very verbose today, taking a long time to answer these questions. But I'll just move on to Ludovic Balam's next question. And he says, would birth contraceptives like condoms, birth control pills, or birth control implants have a similar karmic status to eating meat, considering most men and women don't approach it with the mindset that they are killing a person, especially considering the implant, which happens before pregnancy? Yeah, or the condom, for that matter. So, in a way, yeah, I never really thought about it like that, but yeah, in a way it's similar. Although, I mean, technically the karma would be different, because you've got this, like, the eating food karma compared with having sex karma, and eating food is generally considered to be karmically neutral. Although, I mean, just having greed for the food, just even putting salt and pepper on it to make it taste better would technically be slightly immoral from a Buddhist point of view. Whereas sex, you're getting into the more gross forms of craving and desire and passion and so forth. But yeah, technically, like using a condom, you're not killing even a fertilized egg. You're just preventing the egg from being fertilized. So it'd be sort of like masturbation almost with regard to that, with regard to reproduction. You might as well be shooting blanks. So Yeah, I mean, it's not wearing a condom that is immoral, or using a birth control pill, or using an IUD. I mean, those themselves are not immoral, but the the sex that you're having, after you use these, then usually in Buddhist philosophy, Theravada Buddhist philosophy, sex is so prone to desire. It's so closely linked with desire, usually so motivated by desire and craving and passion that it's really difficult to do it in a way that is not immoral. Even between a husband and wife, just for the sake of having kids, still to do it perfectly morally would be really an accomplishment, which is one reason why Buddhism emphasizes renunciation and celibacy. But it does not promote vegetarianism. So I'll just move on to the next question here. This is from Siovaksh and Sipad Zidana. And Siovaksh and Sipad Zidana says, the Buddha recommends going to a forest, but the Vinaya also says that a monk is not allowed to stay in the wilderness. Can you explain the difference? Because I thought wilderness is anywhere where people don't live, which would include forests. I have no idea how he got this information. I mean, it does not say in Vinaya that a monk can't live in a wilderness. It does say a few things. One, nuns, like bhikkhunis, are not allowed to live in a wilderness, just for their own safety. Also, a monk can't live in a wilderness during the 3 months of the rains retreat, the 3 months of the monsoon, usually the first 3 months. He's not supposed to live in a forest. Like under a tree. He has to have a roof when he's during the rains retreat. Also, it's just a matter of practicality that a monk can't live more than an easy walk or a difficult walk every morning to a village for alms, because he can't store his own food. He can't collect his own food. He's got to be given food by a layperson. So he has to have an alms resort within walking distance. So he can't live, 20 miles out in solitude, in this deep wilderness, because he wouldn't be able to get food that way. I have been told that there have been some wise guy monks that trained monkeys to offer them food. So they could live out there in the wilderness by themselves and the monkey would offer them food. But that's kind of a rare thing, I think. So, yeah, monks are encouraged to live in forests, wild places. So I don't know what he had in mind with his idea that the Vinaya says that a monk is not allowed to stay in a wilderness, unless it's just under certain circumstances, like he's not allowed to live under a tree during the 3 months of the rains retreat and so forth. Or maybe he confused it with bhikkhunis or something. So I'll just move on to Siovaksh and Sipad Zidana's next question. And he says, I remember reading a story of the Buddha letting a monk bring in his blind, homeless parents into the monastery and let them eat alms food. There's also another example of a monk who gave up the robe to look after their sick mother or something and made pottery for a living. Wouldn't these also show that there is more nuance when it comes to practicing above all else? Or maybe they see taking care of parents as much more important than being told to look after your kid while you're in deep samadhi, LOL. Well, it is true that the Buddhist texts put a lot more emphasis on your obligations to your parents than your obligations to your spouse or your own children. That there is a sutta where the Buddha is saying that you could carry your parents around on your back for the rest of your life and you still wouldn't pay them back for all they've done for you. So honoring your own parents is important. There's even a Vinaya rule saying that a monk is not supposed to be ordained. A prospective monk is not supposed to be ordained without his parents' permission. You don't have to have your wife's permission or your kid's permission. You do have to, or supposedly you do have to have your parents' permission. Although if you don't get your parents' permission, you're ordained anyway, the ordination is still valid, but the monks who perform the ordination have committed a minor offense requiring confession. So taking care of your aging parents, if you can do that and practice as a monk anyway, like I was saying I think it was the previous Q&A, then that's fine. There's nothing against that. And there really is a lot of emphasis on your duties to your own parents in the Pali texts. So parents are considered to be very important, almost sacred in Pali, or in the Pali text. So yeah, I think there would be more of an emphasis on taking care of your aging parents than taking care of your wife and children. So I think I should just I don't know if I answered that question. See, I guess the question is, wouldn't these also show that there's more nuance when it comes to practicing above all else? Yeah, especially with regard to parents, I suppose. So I'll just move on to this question. This is from Nirmit. And Nirmit says, can a householder be an Arahant? And personally, I think yes, although the official orthodox answer is no. At least he couldn't be an Arahant for more than about 1 day, because it is the official position of Theravada Buddhism that if you become fully enlightened, you've got a very short time, approximately 24 hours, to get yourself ordained, or you are going to die. Like one famous example is in the Bahia Sutta of the Udana. I think it's Udana 110, where there's a non-Buddhist philosopher named Bahia, literally means outsider, who goes to the Buddha, and he's so receptive to what the Buddha has to say. The Buddha just gives him this short little discourse, which is very cryptic and Zen-like, by the way, and it causes Bahia to become enlightened. But because he is not a monk, an ordained monk, shortly afterwards he gets killed by getting it was like a calf, it was a young cow, I think, like attacks him, like butts into him, hits some vital organ or something. Maybe, I mean, it just kills him just by like running into him and trampling him or something. And if you read the commentaries, there's all this karmic stuff that cow had in a previous life been this prostitute that Bahia was. He was a young man in a different life who raped her to death or something, and so it would cause like this karmic vicious circle of her wanting revenge life after life. But again, I'm digressing. Can a householder be an Arahant? It's such a short question. You'd think that I'd be able to give it like a short, concise answer, wouldn't you? Yeah, I personally think that an Arahant can be a householder. I do not think that you have to be an ordained monk to be fully enlightened. I don't even think you have to be a Theravada Buddhist to be fully enlightened, which is also unorthodox. Because if you're not a Theravada Buddhist, you have wrong view. You have Micha Diti. So if you want the official answer, then it's no. But if you want my personal belief or opinion, then it would be yes. Take your pick. And I'll move on to Nirmit's next question, which is, what is asceticism according to you? And I think the easiest answer to that would be asceticism is being okay with being uncomfortable. However, I think I could tweak that explanation. I could tweak that answer a little, because let's say you've got some rich person living in a mansion. He's got a harem of slave girls. He eats deluxe gourmet food all the time. He rarely feels uncomfortable. So he's okay with it. He's okay with being uncomfortable if it happens, but it just doesn't happen much. Then he might not be considered all that much of an ascetic. So it may be that asceticism is like cultivating yourself so that you are okay with being uncomfortable. You don't have to torture yourself. That's non-Buddhist. That's one of the extremes that a good Buddhist is supposed to avoid when he follows the middle path. But, you're not supposed to just wallow in sensuality either. So asceticism is to some degree avoiding comfort, maybe I could say. And definitely it's like cultivating the ability to accept discomfort with equanimity, discomfort or even pain. So I guess that's my answer. So I'll just move on to Nirmit's next question, which is, why is sense restraint so important in most spiritual practices? Which is, that's a good question. And it's kind of a deep question. And it may be that different spiritual practices will have different reasons. You know, like a Christian might have a different reason than a Buddhist in some cases. Although I think like a good Catholic saint back in the Middle Ages would say sense restraint is important because you have to mortify your self-will. And when you mortify your self-will sufficiently, you just kind of kill your own self-will, you know, your own free will or whatever, and then you become like a puppet of God. You just do the will of God. You know, God just guides you to do what pleases him. And it's sort of a Christian way of explaining that sort of the Buddhist approach, you know, sense restraint. Um, I think, I mean, there's different levels of self-restraint. One is just through morality. You know, you're not going to orgies, for example. That would be a kind of sense restraint. Not going to mosh pits at punk rock concerts. Um, but then, I mean, the real sense restraint is internal. It's mental, where, um, like, if you hear a sound, you just hear it as sound. You're not interpreting that sound as, oh, that's that song that I like, or will the goddamn dog never stop barking? You know, when you just start spinning off into these thoughts, that's not sense restraint. But when you hear the sound only as like sensory stimuli, just as sound itself, or if you see a form just as, you know, just seeing. When you hear is just hearing, when you taste is just tasting, then that would be sense restraint because you're not just spinning off into all this samsaric thinking. Because when you're at the level of just the bare sensation, or as close to the level of bare sensation as you can get, you're closer to ultimate reality, especially from the Orthodox Buddhist point of view. If, like in Abhidhamma, you know, take it or leave it, but Abhidhamma says that sensation, Vedana, or feeling, is ultimately real. That is an ultimate reality. Barking dog is not an ultimate reality. The song that I like is not ultimate reality, but the sound is ultimately real from an Orthodox Theravada Buddhist point of view. So if you are just at the level of the, you know, seeing is only seeing, hearing is only hearing, you know, touching is only touching, you're not interpreting that with perceptual commentary and so forth, then you're at the level of ultimate reality. At least you're closer to ultimate reality. I mean, you're moving closer to enlightenment by just being like the stripped down, almost mystical state of in the seen there's only the seen, in the heard there's only the heard, in the felt there's only the felt. So the cultivation of that is getting you much closer to enlightenment because, I mean, you're training yourself away from all this samsaric perceptual gobbledygook that your mind is just generating pretty much constantly, even in your sleep. So I'll just move on to the next question. I'm not sure how effectively I answered that question, but I gave it a shot. So I'll just move on to Rui's question here. And Rui says, hello, Panyo. What is your view of mantra? Do you think mantra practice as worthy to incline the mind towards Dhamma? I suppose one could concoct mantras out of the Pali Canon? Question mark. I use mantra sometimes. Like I've said before, I om spontaneously. Like om is the main mantra that I've used. There have been times in my life I've used other mantras that also just arose spontaneously, like, Dear God, please have mercy. You know, even though I'm not a theist, it just arose maybe due to momentum, karmic momentum from a past life as a Christian or something. But I have found that mantra I mean, it can be as effective as meditation on the breath. I mean, you can combine the two, like Om, just every out breath, if you're sitting in meditation, is an Om. Or if you're walking, every out breath is an Om. And it requires a certain effort to keep it on the mantra, which makes it better than, in one way, than breath meditation. Because in breath meditation, your mind can just wander away from the breathing, because you're going to breathe whether you're mindful of it or not. But the mantra requires an effort for you to keep doing it, which makes it easier to keep your mind from wandering away from it. So that's one of the main advantages of mantra. But you'd want a mantra that isn't super meaningful. This Om is really good for me. Om Mani Padme Hum, I suppose, would be more Buddhist, although that's Mahayana Buddhist. But the longer and more complicated the mantra is, the more thinking mind is going on, and the less deep your meditation is going to be. Because most meditation, according to the Visuddhimagga, again, take it or leave it, but according to the Visuddhimagga, any kind of meditation that involves thinking, you're never going to get jhana with that. Like the meditation on reflection on the virtues of the Buddha. That's a main one. That's a kind of mantra meditation that a lot of Burmese people will do. Is Idipitho Bhagawa Arahant Thamatham Bodho, etc., etc. They'll go like they'll use a rosary and just one bead every time they do that. And it's not going to be very deep meditation. But if you're like a beginner in meditation, you're not very good at meditation, or your mind just gets really restless sometimes, so you need some kind of mental busy work to keep your mind on Dhamma, or like at least sort of elementary meditation, then it can still be useful. But I think the mantra should be as simple as possible. like Om works for me. A lot of the Thai monks especially use Buddho, although the Thais, I think they pronounce it Butto or Putto. I knew this one guy. He'd been meditating in Thailand, and he actually got upachara samadhi. He started seeing namitta from meditating. He thought he was doing Butto. He didn't even know what it meant. He didn't realize that he was saying Buddha in like a Thai accent. But he got to upachara samadhi with it anyway. He was seeing the nimittas and stuff. So yeah, the content of the mantra, yeah, you want it simple, but it is useful. I think that it can be more effective than breath meditation for some people, although breath meditation may be more effective than mantra for some people. And breath meditation is much more orthodox, I think. Just mantra meditation as mantra, it really isn't endorsed in orthodox Theravada Buddhism, like in the texts. I mean, you've got the ones where you're thinking about stuff that could be a kind of mantra. Also, some traditions in Burma will use the 32 parts of the body, head, hair, body hair, nails, teeth, skin, etc., as a kind of mantra, where they're not even imagining the location or the appearance of the body parts. It's just kind of a mantra that they do. So you can turn some orthodox Buddhist meditations into a kind of mantra meditation. But I do think that mantra can be useful for a lot of people, especially if it's simple. So I'll just move on to the next question here. This is from Edelweiss Voyager. Edelweiss Voyager. And Edelweiss Voyager says, are caves spiritually significant in your opinion? I recall you saying that you spent most of your time in Burma hanging out in caves. Also, Muhammad was spoken to by a kakodaimon in a cave. And my Greek is pretty rudimentary, but I'm pretty sure that kakodaimon means evil spirit. Oh, my golly. I just got warned that. Just a second. Oh, boy. Let's see here. I keep doing this. I keep forgetting to plug in the computer, and then I get this warning that I'm down to 3%. There. My computer is no longer gasping for air. 9%. So getting back to Edelweiss Voyager's question here. Yeah, I think it's kind of a little bit of a dig there to say that the Archangel Gabriel is an evil spirit. Or whoever was masquerading, pretending to be the Archangel Gabriel, or whatever. But the main question, I should make one little correction here. Edelweiss Voyager says, I recall you saying that you spent most of your time in Burma hanging out in caves. Actually, it was maybe a little more than half my time. So I guess that would count as most. I spent maybe 13 or 14 years literally living in caves. But the question here is, are caves spiritually significant? And I don't think that just a cave in and of itself is spiritually significant. It's just a cave. I mean, there are advantages to living in caves. Like, for example, if you're living in the tropics, during the daytime in the blazing heat, a cave could be 20 degrees Fahrenheit, at least, cooler than the outside air. Like the main cave that I lived in. Ironically, the one place I've lived longer than anywhere else in my life was a cave at Wonbo Wildlife Refuge Monastery, Wonbo Bemet Dojang. And the inside of that cave was just all year round around 83, 84 degrees Fahrenheit. And that's just sort of like the average temperature of the entire area. You know, if you combine, night and day and cold season and hot season and everything, you just take the temperature of that place, just the mean temperature over the entire course of the year, day and night, all the seasons, everything. It was around 83, 84 degrees. And it went like 50 feet into the side of a hill. So it was like a constant 83, 84 degrees if I had the door closed. But so, I mean, that was way better than 115 or 120 outside during the hot season. So, I mean, that's useful. I mean, it's better for solitude, especially if you got a door on the cave that you can latch from the inside to keep out bats, rats, humans, and snakes. But I mean, in and of themselves, caves are not spiritually significant. I mean, any more significant than any other rock formation. It's just a hole in the side of a hill. So I think I'll just move on to the next question here. And this is from Saint Sword or Saint's Word. It's Saint and then S, which could be Saints and then Word, or it could be Saint and then Sword. I'm guessing it's Saint Sword. So Saint Sword or Saint's Word says, and I think this isn't even a question, but it's in the comments below a Q&A video, and it's worthy of some comment. So I'm just gonna read it anyway, even though I don't think there's a single question mark in this entire thing. Saint Sword says, formless nothingness is still an object of consciousness, albeit very subtle. That's what the Arupa jhanas, or a 20 milligram dose of 5-MeO-DMT are. Advaita Vedanta takes this to be the end, notices there is still a self, and concludes that there is a subtle self, which they term consciousness without an object in the absolute. This is exactly why they're incorrect. Consciousness is still taking a very subtle object. It still has gone through the process of paticca samuppada and become nothingness. Talk to someone that's recently gone into this state of consciousness. They'll even tell you that the I was still there, the I. If they can remember, it's easy to forget when coming back from this state, just noticing nothingness. Nibbana is not consciousness, nor form nor formless. It's gone beyond. It's blowing out all of the consciousness, self, or any objects, gross or subtle. Further, it's really important to distinguish between emptiness and nothingness. Nothingness is a subtle object. The empty set is a set of nothingness. It's still a set, it just doesn't have any members. Emptiness is a step further. It's where there's no set to even be empty. The sixth patriarch of Zen story demonstrates this really well. The student that was supposed to succeed the fifth patriarch wrote a poem about how one should remain pure. That's nothingness. Nothingness is as pure as one can get. The poor farmer who actually became the sixth patriarch wrote 2 poems about how there is nothing to become pure. There's no place for dust to land and make impurity. That's emptiness. Well, I would say that the word for zero in Burmese is thonya, which is the Pali word for emptiness or empty. And I mean, there's some of this that I wouldn't entirely agree with, which is why I'm commenting here. With all due respect to Saint Sword and his sword, which may be sharp and pointy, like formless consciousness, there's a difference between formless consciousness and the concept of formless consciousness. Like if you perceive formless consciousness, that's not formless consciousness anymore. So if you make formless consciousness an object, then it's not really formless consciousness anymore. You can have, like as he points out, one of the formless jhanas, one of the formless contemplative states, one of the very advanced ones, is the realm of infinite nothingness. Or there's another one, the realm of infinite consciousness. And I've hypothesized that those are both ways of describing enlightenment that became unorthodox as the philosophy evolved, and so they just got put into this higher than fourth jhana, but still below enlightenment sort of status. But the thing is, like Advaita Vedanta is, I mean, if they're saying that like the ultimate is formless consciousness, and there are a few Pali texts that imply also that the ultimate is formless consciousness, that there's a difference between saying that the ultimate is formless consciousness and just having this idea that just confusing the idea with the formless consciousness itself. Because I mean, the same thing can happen in Orthodox Buddhism. You've got Nibbana. I mean, Nibbana is very different from the concept of Nibbana. I mean, Nibbana is different from Nibbana. And so somebody can meditate on or contemplate Nibbana, but so long as it's a perceptual object, it's not Nibbana. And the same is true of formless consciousness. So long as it is a perceptual object, it's not formless consciousness. So, and then it says here that Advaita Vedanta takes this to be the end, notices there is still a self, and concludes that there's a subtle self, which they term consciousness without an object in the absolute. But really, I mean, it's not that you have a self until you reach Nibbana. I mean, you have a concept of a self until you reach Nibbana. Maybe even after you become enlightened, you could still have a concept of a self, but you just know that it's just a concept. You're not identifying with it or thinking that it's real. So it's really difficult. If you're trying to intellectually understand something, I mean, you can't intellectually understand reality, ultimate reality. It just cannot work. So you can say that so long as if formless consciousness becomes an object, it's not formless consciousness anymore. It's a perception of formless consciousness. So let's see. Also, I'd make a few little quibbles here, like emptiness is, let's see, where is it here? This is kind of a long one here. Nothingness is the empty set is a set of nothingness. Well, I would say that nothingness would just be the set of zero. Like in Burmese, thonya or sunya is the word for zero, whereas emptiness would be like the empty set. That's why it's called the empty set, because it's empty. It doesn't even have zero in it. So, I mean, you can interpret it differently, of course, which may be just as valid or invalid as my interpretation. So, yeah, the sixth patriarch of Zen, we needn't even get into that. I was really disillusioned when I read. It was a translation of the Sutra of Hui Neng, who is supposedly the sixth patriarch, and it was giving evidence that Hui Neng probably wasn't really the sixth patriarch, but the real sixth patriarch had this lineage that died out. And so Huineng was sort of retroactively installed as the sixth and last patriarch of Zen. But we can get into that maybe some other time. Don't want to disillusion people too much. So, yeah, I mean, you can say that emptiness is anything that is not perceived. And that would be a good way of describing emptiness. Because once you perceive something, you've got a set. And even if you're perceiving nothingness, that's just the set of zero. But yeah, I'm not trying to like pick nits or anything here. I'll just move on to the next question. This is from Sandeep. And Sandeep says, there is a common belief among Buddhists, especially monastics, that only an understanding of dependent origination can lead to liberation. As far as I know, the Buddha also said that the teaching of dependent origination is unique to him. So I was surprised when, in a past Q&A, you said that there might be more Hindu gurus who are enlightened than Theravada monks. And then he's got 4 questions here. 1. Since most other traditions don't even mention dependent origination, how do you think they got enlightened? Do you think they understand the same ideas in a different way? I might be wrong, but I don't feel other traditions talk about similar ideas: dukkha, impermanence, dependent origination, not self. Well, I mean, possibly the backbone of Buddhism, at least Theravada Buddhism, is the Four Noble Truths. And the third noble truth is the truth of cessation, which means when clinging ceases, dukkha ceases. You know, when you stop having desires and attachment, you stop suffering. So, I mean, if you just go with that, I mean, you might have to argue that you would have to understand in some intellectual way dependent co-arising in order to stop having desires. And I don't think that that's necessarily the case. I mean, you can have like this intuitive grasp or an intuitive appreciation of something along the lines of dependent origination where you're not seeing this outer world as ultimately real. And like a Christian saint, like Saint John of the Cross, for example, would consider this external world not to be ultimately real, but it would just be like generated by the power of God or whatever. I think Hindus would largely feel that way also. Um, let's see. Yeah, I mean it is true that dependent co-arising or paticca samuppada, it is emphasized very strongly in Theravada Buddhism, but at the same time, it's pretty obvious that very few Theravada Buddhists really understand it. You know, it just very quickly, relatively speaking, it got ossified into the 12 links. You know, this causes this causes this. It's just like this linear sequence that monks memorize. And if they want to understand it any better than just memorizing it, they memorize what the commentary says. Or they memorize, you know, something in a sutta. But the suttas usually it's just the same stock phrases that are inserted. So, yeah, I mean, dependent origination, I think the Buddha understood it intuitively, and he can't really talk about it much because it's so hard to talk about. I think it wasn't until Nagarjuna came along hundreds of years later that at least there was like a sophisticated philosophical way of sort of almost talking about it. But once you try to turn it into a formula, you've lost it. So it could be that you've got enlightened people that just intuitively understand that this world is not ultimately real and that it's, in a way, we're dreaming it. That it's sort of a creation of all these different not ultimately real causes that are all reinforcing each other to make each other look like they're real when it's not real. And you know, the Hindus do have the idea of Maya, except they can't really explain it intellectually. They refer to it as sort of like Deva Lila. It's sort of the play of the gods or something, that creating this world. Um, but I think most Buddhist attempts um, really are not much more sophisticated, because they're just the 12 Nidana theories. Naweza Pisya Thinkara Thinkara Pisya Wenyanan. They just memorize this stuff, and then they think they understand it when really they don't. So yeah, it is true though. What Sandeep says here is true, that an understanding of dependent co-arising is very much emphasized in the texts, although it's pretty clear that most monks, even monks that were writing texts or composing texts, didn't really understand it. So it is kind of a strange situation. In fact, according to the legend, the Buddha almost became a hermit. He almost became a Pacceka Buddha and just was enlightened, but just was going to keep his mouth shut and not even try to teach Dhamma, because he figured nobody would understand dependent co-arising. And for like Burmese scholar monks to think they understand it, when the Buddha himself almost was in despair of teaching Dhamma because he figured nobody would understand it. Whereas, any Burmese monk who's been to a monastic school thinks he understands it. I mean, it's very naive and not very well informed. But it is kind of a like a paradox or an enigma though, because I mean, it's something you just have to kind of grok. It's more of an intuitive appreciation than an intellectual formula that you memorize and master. So, yeah, I did not fully answer that to my own satisfaction, but it's when you get into this stuff, some of it is literally impossible to explain correctly or validly, because it's just off the scale. Anything that you try and crystallize it down into intellectual thoughts and words, I mean, you've already lost it. So I'll just move on to Sandeep's next question here. Part 2. Do you agree with the idea that the Buddha was this supreme and unique spiritual teacher, or do you think there have always been beings who were able to become enlightened without the Buddhist teachings? It is a common belief among Buddhists that you can't become enlightened without the instructions of a Buddha. Well, if you read some suttas, the Buddha is talking about enlightened beings before him and enlightened beings at the same time as him and enlightened beings in the future. I think the whole idea that only a Buddha that is above the level of an ordinary Arahant, that is omniscient, who has perfected all of the paramis, all 10 of them, that only he can become enlightened without a teacher or a tradition to follow. And I am skeptical of that. I have been skeptical of that for a long time. I still think that, for all I know, there may have been more enlightened Hindus than enlightened Theravada Buddhists. Like, if I had to name 2 people of the 20th century that I thought were fully enlightened, 2 of my best guesses would be Neem Karoli Baba and Ramana Maharshi, and both of them were Hindus. So, I mean, they weren't the same kind of Hindu, definitely. Just with regard to, Ramana Maharshi was a Shaivite Hindu, and Neem Karoli Baba was like a devotee of Hanuman. So he was more into the Vishnu aspect of the highest god. And just their personalities were very different from each other. Ramana Maharshi was just the orthodox, no scandal saint. It was saintly in every possible way that you could think of. Whereas Neem Karoli Baba was a rascal, but he would just look right through you. I mean, he would perform psychic powers that would just have people just completely, just beyond astonished. In fact, sometimes he would do that to open a person up. He would do this miracle, just tell them exactly what they're thinking, or tell them exactly what they were thinking the night before or whatever, just to break down their concept of what is possible, so that they're in a state of existential crisis, and then he can just tell them exactly what they need to hear, and boop. But I think, again, I'm digressing from the question here. Do I agree that the idea that the Buddha was a supreme and unique spiritual teacher? I think that he was a spiritual genius, possibly an intellectual genius as well. But I do not think that you have to be an orthodox Buddhist to become enlightened. And I do think it's possible for some people who are just ripe to become enlightened. Like, even Theravada Buddhism accepts that there are Pacceka Buddhas who become enlightened on their own, without teachers, just during the times when there is no Buddhism in the world, when there is no Dhamma. So, yeah, I think that to some degree, the Theravada Buddhist idea that only a Theravada Buddhist can become enlightened, and that, the whole idea of these Buddhas who have been cultivating the perfections for countless eons in order to become a Buddha who can set the wheel rolling and so forth. I think that's largely mythology. I really do. That is my best honest guess as to the state of enlightened beings, I guess. So let's see. Did I answer the question? That is the question now. Did I answer the question? Do I agree with the idea that the Buddha was a supreme and unique spiritual teacher? Well, in a way, there was no one better than him because he reached the top. I mean, he was beyond the top. He was off the scale. So, I mean, at the very best, somebody could tie for first place with him. And he was certainly a unique spiritual teacher, I mean, in human history. But on the other hand, I also think that there have always been beings who were able to become enlightened without the Buddhist teachings. So I accept both. So I think I'll just move on to the part 3 of Sandeep's question. Do you think enlightened beings from other traditions also go through the 4 stages of enlightenment? Early Buddhism and Theravada seems pretty rigid on how awakening happens in these stages. Well, I've talked about the 4 stages of enlightenment also. I do think that is anachronistic, that it was a later development in Buddhist philosophy. That, for example, the first suttas of the Itivuttaka use anagami as a synonym for arahant. Sotapanna probably originally just meant someone who had just started firmly upon the path of Dhamma. They would be sort of like the equivalent of a born again Christian. That the earliest texts never even mention Sakadagamis, who are only going to get born again one more time before. I mean, they don't. What is it? Sakadagamis. Yeah, they just have one more earthly, worldly existence before they become enlightened. And also, you don't necessarily, I'm pretty sure even Orthodox Theravada says, you don't necessarily go through 4 stages of sainthood. That you can just go from Putujana, unenlightened commoner, straight to fully enlightened. I mean, there might be like 2 moments, like in Abhidhamma, you got path and fruition. So like each of these 4 stages of sainthood, like Sotapanna, Sakadagami, Anagami, and Arahant, there's like 2 stages. There's the path stage and the fruition stage. And for some strange reason, the Abhidhamma philosophy says that the path stage lasts just this trillionth of a second, which, I mean, it's just, why even bother even talking about it? In other parts of the text, it says, that there are the 8 individuals worthy of offerings, and that's, each of the 4 stages in the path stage and in the fruition stage. So that makes 8. But how are you going to make offerings to someone in a trillionth of a second when they're at the path stage? It's just, Abhidhamma's got some weird stuff to it. And just Orthodox Theravada, partly as a consequence of this, also just has this stuff that if you're really faith-oriented, you don't want to take a critical approach to your own religion, because that's blasphemous and dangerous and the road to hell and all that, then you can just gloss over it and you don't notice it because you don't want to notice it. But if you're a critically minded Westerner or anybody capable of applying critical thought to your own religion, which does make perfect sense. I mean, it's a good idea, at least from my point of view. You don't want to believe what isn't true. I mean, it depends. A faith-oriented person, if it works for them, then that's good enough. They don't want to look at it too closely to see if it's true. They just want to know that it's true. And that's, like confirmation bias or whatever. That's happens in politics all the time in the West. It happens with regard to a lot of things. Happens with regard to a person's own family. You just have this bias, and you just do not want that bias challenged. But the whole 4 stages of enlightenment, I think, was not original to the Buddha. And even if it was, you don't have to go through the sequential steps. I mean, you can skip over one step and just go straight to Arahant. Pretty sure. So, and then there's no other mentions like in other traditions, except St. John of the Cross. I've mentioned this before, that he did have a system that was sort of weirdly similar to the Buddhist system of not the four stages of enlightenment, but the stage of the Putujana, or the common worldling, who is not a saint at all. And then you've got the Seika, the person in training. And from the Orthodox Theravadan point of view, that would be Sotapannas, Sakadagamis, and Anagamis. And then you've got the perfect, the perfected. Oh, wait, the Aseka, the one who is not in training. I'm confusing my Christianity with my Buddhism here. So you've got Putujana, common worldling, Seika, a saint who's still not fully enlightened, and then the Aseka, one who is no longer in training because he is fully enlightened. He's an Arahant. St. John of the Cross, possibly with no awareness of what Theravada Buddhism teaches, he had the level of like the common person, the worldling. I can't remember what they were called. The beginner, I think that's what they call it, the beginner. Then you have the adept. That's the adept in contemplation, which would probably be at least second jhana from a Buddhist point of view. And then you've got the perfected. And that surprised me because in Christianity, I'm pretty sure the Orthodox, the Bible itself says nobody is worthy. Even Jesus himself denied being good. Somebody called him good master or good teacher or something in one of the books of the New Testament. And he says, why do you call me good? There's none good except God. So in that scene, Jesus was apparently denying not only being God, but even denying being good or perfect. But St. John of the Cross, apparently from his own experience, had this system that's very similar to Theravada Buddhism, not with regard to the four stages, but with regard to three stages of common worldling, the saint who is adept but not yet enlightened, and then the enlightened being. So, yeah, for me, that's another little bit of evidence that the four stages of sainthood are kind of an artifact, a later development, because no other spiritual system mentions it, although there are kind of similar approaches. So I'll just move on to Sandeep's fourth part of this question, or fourth question, which is, do you think the views one holds or the map one follows has an influence on how progress on the spiritual path unfolds for them? Well, certainly, yeah. I mean, your beliefs are going to largely determine your behavior, at least with regard to your training, and your official beliefs, your understanding of the religion. You're going to have like subliminal, subconscious stuff that's influencing it, and just like past karma, just giving you momentum in certain directions. But certainly, even though Catholic mystic, a contemplative, like a discalced Carmelite, like St. John of the Cross, had practices very similar to Buddhism and possibly end results similar to Buddhism, that still, I mean, you're going to have a different approach. It's sort of like you can do like a mathematics problem with geometry or with algebra, and the steps will be very different, but you'll arrive at the same place. You'll still come up with the correct answer, even though you went to two different approaches. I do think to some degree, especially intellectually, that works. I mean, still, the Four Noble Truths, you have to, it's like desire is the cause of suffering and so forth. If you don't want suffering, you get rid of the desire and that sort of thing. I mean, that's going to be true regardless. But the different approaches, now different people have different temperaments, different characters, different approaches can work for them. There's not just one only way. And that was one of the criticisms I had of the Mahasi method, which was, and might still be, the most popular meditation method in Burma. And that is that they just give you one method. And like U Pandita, who was a very fierce kind of a teacher, that, if you weren't responding to this one method, you just get scolded. You just get chewed out for it. And it was like a doctor who would give the same medicine to every patient. And if the patient didn't get better, the patient would get chewed out for not being sick properly. It's kind of like that. So there's more than one way of practicing Dhamma, more than one approach. You know, like some people are more heart and feelings and faith oriented. Other people are more head and like philosophy oriented, philosophically minded. You know, religion versus philosophy. You know, head versus heart. So there's going to be different approaches, but they're all heading towards the same goal, even though they might define them differently at first. Like freedom from suffering sounds different from freedom from delusion, but they're the same thing. But the heart-oriented person might be more motivated by freeing himself from suffering, whereas the more intellectual, philosophical person might be more motivated to free himself from delusion. But it's the same result. But if your religion is like a Jehovah's Witness or something, enlightenment isn't even a concept. It's not even acknowledged as possible. Then that's going to definitely have it's definitely going to be, in most cases, an insurmountable obstacle. That if you did make significant spiritual progress, aside from just really ground level, cleaning your life up and becoming more moral in a worldly sense, then, you'd be doing it largely in spite of the system rather than because of it. So, I guess I'll just move on to the next question here. And this is from Austin. And Austin says, do you believe the cheetah is never born and never dies? Or is this just a sneaky way to slide the concept of Atman into Buddhism? Well, by cheetah here, I'm referring to mind and not the spotted wild cat. Although ultimately they have the same etymology, I think. No, wait, no, they don't. But cheetah, the spotted, the world's fastest running animal is, the word does come from Sanskrit. It just means variegated. But again, I'm just digressing all over the place today. I could reduce the length of this video by half and still not get rid of any of the actual answers to the questions. So anyway, let's see. Do I believe that the mind, the cheetah, is never born and never dies? So that'd be like consciousness. Or is this just a sneaky way to slide the concept of Atman into Buddhism? Well, again, we have the paradox of the cheetah, it doesn't really exist until it is perceived. And then it's not cheetah anymore, it's the perception of cheetah. Because we're just living in perceptions right now. Our understanding of the world is perceptual. So again, you could say that consciousness is never born and never dies, but you can't say that it exists or doesn't exist. We're still in this paradoxical state of anything that is formless and infinite, and thus is never born and never dies. You can't say that it exists or doesn't exist. That you could take either approach. And so, like with regard to Nibbana, it's the same way with Nibbana. It's like, or ultimate reality, let's just say the absolute. You can say it exists or it doesn't exist. But either way, it's not valid. To say that it exists is invalid. To say that it doesn't exist is invalid. To say that it does and doesn't exist is invalid. To say that it neither does nor doesn't exist is invalid. But in order to talk about it, you have to pick one. And so the Buddhists pretty much picked isn't and mostly went with that. Whereas, for example, the Vedantist Hindus picked is and went with that. And both have their good points and their bad points, but neither one is ultimately valid. Because you just have to leave all these perceptions and names and concepts behind in order to really know the truth. So, in a sense, you can say that the cheetah is never born and never dies, but if you insist upon that, you make a big deal of it. You cling to that, say only this is true and anything else is wrong, then that could very easily just turn into a kind of self-view, where you're identifying with your own cheetah that is eternal and immortal and all that. So I mean, these kind of questions are the most difficult questions to answer, and I answer them pretty frequently. Like in the course of these Q&As, it's probably a few dozen times I've answered the same kinds of questions in pretty much the same way, but I mean, it's just invalid. I mean, any kind of answer isn't going to really hit the nail on the head. I mean, you just cannot understand ultimate reality intellectually by thinking about it. It just isn't going to happen because you're just going to be stuck in concepts. And the concept is very different. The concept of nibbana is very different from actual nibbana, or whatever it happens to be. So I'll just move on to Austin's next question here. And this is a strange one. He says, it seems to me early Buddhism truly embraced hallucinatory experiences as a genuine and significant source of knowledge, considering that in the ancient world illnesses and diseases could lead to hallucinations, and even today conditions like tropical fever and extreme exhaustion can induce such phenomena. How does Buddhism distinguish between hallucinations and authentic experiences, especially given that hallucinatory encounters form a foundational aspect of the religion? Instances of people conversing with gods, glimpses of past and future incarnations, visions of heaven and hell, visions of demons, yetis, and ghosts, as well as teleportation to other realms, seem to be present in the Pali Canon, suggesting that Buddhists approach these experiences with earnestness, deeming them real and pivotal in bolstering faith within the community. Every indication of in the Pali Canon is that the Buddha takes this very seriously and that he regards these all as real. How does a skeptical Westerner approach this with serious earnestness? Thanks. Well, I mean, first of all, it seems to me pretty obvious here that Austin is just assuming that, for example, people conversing with gods, glimpses of past and future incarnations, visions of heaven and hell, visions of demons, yetis, and ghosts, as well as teleportation to other realms, that all of that is just hallucination. And of course, Buddhism does not accept that as hallucination. Buddhism accepts that as real as anything else, as real as this beverage. And so, I mean, Austin here just seems to be assuming with a modern Western mind that, what science can explain is not real, and that, all this like visions and conversing with gods and so forth, it's all just hallucinations. But that's not the assumption made in the texts. It's not necessarily my assumption, unless you want to assume that even this beverage is a hallucination. And I could go with that. That this world, we're in a kind of matrix, we're in a kind of dream world, and none of this is real. So you could say, the gods that someone is conversing with aren't real, that, seeing their clairvoyant visions aren't real. But then again, the beverage isn't real either. I'm not real. The books aren't real. So how does a skeptical Westerner approach this with serious earnestness? I'm not sure how skeptical Austin is here, because, I mean, if you believe that it's an illusion, that's not skepticism. Skepticism is the suspension of judgment. That is skepticism in the classical sense, suspension of judgment. If you're like a skeptic nowadays, like the skeptics of paranormal activities, like the Amazing Randy and this group called Psychop, who call themselves skeptics, but they firmly believe that psychic powers are bullshit. And so they're not skeptics at all. I mean, they're firmly believing something. They're just firmly believing the opposite of what somebody else believes. So, I mean, if you believe that something is real, I mean, that's not skepticism. If you firmly believe just to the same extent that something isn't real, that's not skepticism either. You're just still you're positively believing something. You're just believing the opposite of what somebody else is believing, or you're believing the negation of something. that Sasquatch isn't real instead of Sasquatch is real. So, yeah, I'm not sure where Austin stands with regard to that. There is a word for hallucination, at least one word in Pali, like vipallasa is often translated as hallucination or as like a perversion of perception. So that even though all of this could be a kind of illusion or hallucination, still, like someone who is sick, someone who's on drugs, someone who's delirious, I mean, they can have, even from like the conventional view, they can see what isn't really there. But pretty obviously in Theravada Buddhism, a lot of this, most of this stuff that Austin is mentioning is not considered to be a vipallasa or perversion of perception, that, it's just as real as anything else. So how does the skeptical Westerner approach this with serious earnestness? For one thing, don't just cling to, it's true or it's not true. Just be open-minded and accept everything as a hypothesis. Like you read a Pali text, if it speaks to you, that's fine. If you think it's just unbelievable, that's fine. But still try to be open-minded. Try to have an open mind and just, accept at least the important stuff as a working hypothesis. If you cling to something, only this is true, anything else is wrong, then, you're not going to make much progress. At least you're not going to make very advanced progress. You can still make a lot of progress at the beginning. That might even be helpful. You're just fired up with faith, then, that can really inspire you to clean up your life and get on the track. But eventually, you're going to have to let that stuff go. So, how does a skeptical Westerner approach this with serious earnestness? Well, first of all, you should seriously consider the possibility that psychic powers, for example, might be just as real as beverages. And just accept it as a you don't have to insist that it's true. You don't have to insist that it's not true. You just be open-minded about it. But I think a lot of skeptical Westerners, they're like the guy whose sickness is caused by the medicine he takes. It's too much panya and not enough sada, too much cleverness and not enough faith, or not enough confidence or something. So, yeah, but a person who just insists that the dog distracted me a little bit. Somebody who just insists that, like the Western point of view, like the Western approach to understanding reality, like scientific empiricism, that is right and true, and that previous cultures were superstitious and they didn't know the truth, but now we know it, then, you're pretty much stuck. You're not going to make much progress with that kind of an attitude. It helps to be open-minded. It helps to realize that everybody thinks, well, people in past cultures were superstitious and ignorant, but we got it figured out. The Christians thought that about the pagans. The pagans were wrong, but we Christians, we've got it figured out. And then along came, the Renaissance, and then the Reformation, no, not the Reformation, the Enlightenment, and then you've got scientific materialists saying, well, those Christians got it wrong, and then let alone the pagans before them, but now we got it figured out. And there's going to be something that comes after scientific empiricism. It may not completely phase out scientific empiricism, just as scientific empiricism hasn't completely phased out Christianity. There's still a lot of church-going Christians, especially in South Carolina. So don't be too sure. Any kind of intellectual idea isn't going to be reality. It's just not. You're not going to understand reality by thinking about it. Just keep that in mind, even. So the next question is from Joe Doe. And Joe Doe says, can you confirm that Brian Ruhe is Canada's highest speaker of truth? And Brian Ruhe is a good friend of mine. I really do like him. But I'm kind of skeptical of him being Canada's highest speaker of truth, because he is sort of non-critical with regard to certain things. He's worked out this system that works for him, But like just recently, he came out with a video about how the landing on the moon was fake, but the U.S. government nevertheless does have UFOs that fly to the moon regularly. And or I mean, it's just a lot of his ideas. I really don't agree with a lot of his ideas. So, I mean, he's a good guy, and I like him, and I like doing shows with him. We should be doing more shows pretty soon. But I don't think that he is necessarily Canada's highest speaker of truth. I mean, Eckhart Tolle lives not far from Brian, and I think he might be a better speaker of truth. But I haven't listened to Eckhart Tolle in a while. So, anyways, very last question is from White Ash Piper. This is the last question of them all for this episode. And White Ash Piper says, could you speak on the Buddhist concept of non-attachment? And yeah, I mean, non-attachment, it's like clinging. It's one of the links in the 12 links of the Orthodox version of dependent co-arising. It's usually it's upadana in Pali, and literally that means uptake. It can also mean fuel, like firewood. And this non-attachment is like not desiring, not clinging, not insisting upon things being a certain way, because the world isn't going to cater to your preferences. The external world, to some degree, you're creating it, but you're not creating it in an enlightened way. So that, I mean, even though most people in the West would agree that when we have dreams, that it's our own mind generating these dreams, but stuff happens in dreams that you don't like, even though it's your own mind creating it. And this waking life, so-called, is similar. So I think I'm digressing though. Non-attachment. Oh yeah, just insisting upon things being a certain way. That would be attachment. That would be a really good, concise way of defining attachment in like a Buddhist ethical sense. Is just insisting upon things being a certain way, because it's just not always going to be that way. I mean, nobody always gets everything that they want. And if you've ever watched old episodes of The Twilight Zone, there's been at least one or two episodes of somebody finally does get everything that they want, and then they realize that they're in hell instead of heaven. They think they're in heaven. They realize that they died. But so yeah, no, it's when you insist upon things being a certain way, you're creating friction, especially when you don't get what you want, and then you suffer. It's like you are at odds with the empirical universe, and the empirical universe is going to win. So it's best just to be able to accept whatever happens, because you can't really stop it anyway. I mean, you can take precautions. You can make sure your car has gas and oil and enough air in the tires and so forth. But that's different from just refusing to accept that you just ran out of gas. Or just worrying that you might run out of gas. That's suffering. And I mean, it's relatively mild. You will survive. But I'm sorry, I'm not being very systematic in this explanation. Can you speak on the Buddhist concept of non-attachment? Yeah, I mean, the essence of it is just insisting upon things being a certain way. And I mean, it's not wise to insist upon things being a certain way. Not even yourself. I mean, trying to insist that other people be in a certain way, which is like what many millions of people in the West, tens of millions, maybe hundreds of millions of people in the West are doing, insisting that people not do anything that they consider to be offensive, for example, or insisting that they live their lives a certain way. I mean, it's not just a postmodern invention. People have been this way for a long time. Anyone who stands out and doesn't conform might wind up being burned at the stake or something. And then I've lost the thread. Man, I really lost the thread that time. So I guess that indicates that I've been talking too much, because we've been at this for a little over 2 hours. So White Ash Piper, can you speak on the Buddhist concept of non-attachment? Yeah, just insisting upon things being a certain way. That would be um, what causes suffering. That, I mean, because when things don't happen the way you want, then you're just against the way things are. So you just have to accept the way things are. Although, again, you can take wise precautions. But it's not like you're doing it out of fear of something bad happening or anything like that. It's the right thing to do. It's what you should do. You should brush your teeth so you don't get tooth decay, you know. But it's not like you do it out of fear of tooth decay. It's just what you do. It's sort of like a minor duty just to keep your body going and healthy and so forth. So I guess I answered it. Non-attachment. Gosh. Kind of surprising that one is possibly one of the most difficult questions to answer. Or it was so easy that I was able to answer it in one sentence, and then I'm just like grasping at straws for like additional stuff to like digress and ramble and yammer about. So let's just call it good. I hope White Ash Piper can at least somewhat approve of my answer. And feel free to ask questions. That's what I'm here for, is to answer your questions as best I can. And of course, I'm more likely to be able to answer the question if they're about Buddhism, especially Theravada Buddhism, or about my own personal experiences, or like living in Burma or caves, that kind of thing. I do know some Western philosophy, Western literature, that kind of a thing. But I'd have to say that my field of expertise is Theravada Buddhism. And any questions you've got about like what the earliest Buddhism was like, or Theravada, or again, any of that stuff, feel free. You're very welcome to ask. Try to keep questions down to no more than 6 per episode. And just leave your questions below in the comments. I guess that would be a good place. If you have access to the Discord server, you can ask them there. If you have access to the my Subscribe Star channel, you can ask them there. And feel free to like and subscribe if you haven't already. And look at the links down below and be happy.